There is a moment most people know well. You want something, you need something, and so you ask for it, clearly, directly, maybe even carefully. You've thought about the words. You've chosen the right time. You've prepared yourself for the conversation. You've thought through the arguments, the reasons, the way you'll respond if things get complicated. And still, it doesn't work. Maybe the answer is no. Maybe the answer is silence. Maybe you get what you asked for, but not really. Not in the way you meant. Not with the energy you were hoping for. Just the hollow shape of what you wanted, handed to you without warmth, without buy-in, without the feeling that anything real changed. And so you wonder what went wrong. You went through the effort. You used the right words. You explained your reasons. You were reasonable. You were clear. And still, something didn't land the way you thought it would. This happens to almost everyone. More than people admit. You see it in conversations where the other person listens but doesn't really hear. They nod, they seem engaged, and then nothing changes. You see it in meetings where you make your point, but something shifts in the room before you even finish talking. A subtle closing off. A quiet decision being made that has nothing to do with the quality of what you're saying. You see it in relationships where you say exactly what you need, and somehow it still doesn't change anything. The same dynamic continues. The same pattern repeats. Asking, it turns out, is not always enough. Sometimes asking is not even the right move. And that idea is what this audiobook is about. Not tricks, not manipulation, not ways to get people to do things against their interests or against their will. Something quieter than that. Something more sustainable. Something that works not because you've learned a clever line or memorized a psychological technique, but because you've understood something true about how human beings actually respond to each other. Something that works because of who you are, not because of what you've rehearsed. Most of us were taught, in one way or another, that the way to get what you want is to ask for it. Clearly and directly. Be specific. Make your case. State your needs. Be brave enough to put the question out there. And sometimes that works. Of course it does. Direct asking is valuable. There are many situations where the clearest path to what you want is simply to name it. But more often than people realize, the outcome of a situation is already forming before you open your mouth. The response someone has to you. The yes or the no, the help or the resistance, the openness or the wall, is shaped long before words are exchanged. It's shaped by how you carry yourself, by what you've demonstrated over time, by how they feel in your presence, how they feel about themselves when they're around you, by what the situation signals to them, by what asking even means in this particular moment, with this particular person, given everything that's happened between you up to now. Think about the last time someone asked you for something and you immediately, without hesitation, said yes. Not because you had to. Not because you felt pressured, not because you were calculating an obligation, but because it felt natural to say yes, almost because it felt good to say yes. Try to remember that feeling, the ease of it, the way saying yes felt like the obvious thing to do, and then think about the last time someone asked you for something and you felt a pull of resistance before they even finished their sentence. Something in you leaned back, just slightly. Something in you wanted to say no, or to stall, or to find a reason why now isn't the right time, before you even processed what they were actually asking. In both of those situations, something happened before the words. Something about the person, something about the context, something about the history between you and the way it had been built, or neglected, or strained. Something about how the ask itself arrived, whether it felt natural or forced, aligned or out of place. Something that was already in motion before anyone asked anything. That is what this audiobook explores. What is already happening before you ask? What are you already communicating before you speak? What has already been decided, or at least strongly shaped, before anyone opens their mouth? And more importantly, Can you understand that space well enough to move through it with more awareness, more skill, and more of the results you actually want? The answer is yes, but it requires a different kind of thinking than most people apply to communication and influence. It requires stepping back from the moment of asking and looking at everything that came before it. The signals you've been sending over time, the way you've been showing up in ordinary moments, the clarity, or lack of it, in how you move through situations, the energy you bring when you're not performing anything, the way you position what you want in relation to what others want, the quality of presence you've been offering or failing to offer. None of that is manipulation. All of it is real. Because the truth is, people don't respond primarily to your words. They respond to you, to your presence, to their sense of who you are and what your requests mean, to the context you've built, consciously or unconsciously, around every interaction. When you understand that, really understand it, something changes. You stop trying harder. You start trying differently. You stop rehearsing better arguments and start paying attention to what your presence is already communicating. You stop wondering why asking isn't working and start noticing what's happening before the ask. You stop measuring your skill in communication by how persuasively you can make a case and start measuring it by how naturally people move toward what you want when you haven't even made the case yet. That shift is what this audiobook is designed to create. And it begins with something simple. It begins with understanding why asking sometimes fails, and what that failure actually reveals about what's really happening in any social interaction. Because the failure of an ask is never just a failure of words. It is always information. It is telling you something about the foundation that either is or isn't in place. About the relationship, the context, the signals, the dynamics that exist in the space around the words. And when you learn to read that information, when you stop treating a failed ask as bad luck or bad timing and start treating it as data about something worth understanding, you gain a perspective that changes everything. You start seeing interactions differently. You start seeing what was already working for or against you before you opened your mouth. You start understanding what could have been done earlier in quieter moments that would have made this moment unnecessary. And from that understanding, a different way of moving through relationships and situations begins to emerge. Not passive, not silent, not hoping things happen without effort, active in the right places, quiet in the right moments, working on the things that actually create outcomes rather than the things that merely feel like they should. That is where we begin. Before we continue, if you're finding value in what you're hearing, take a moment right now to subscribe wherever you're listening. Let's start with something that might be uncomfortable. When your ask doesn't work, when the answer is no, or silence, or something less than what you needed, it's rarely about the words you chose. People tend to believe otherwise. They replay the conversation afterward. They think, if I had phrased it differently, if I had asked at a better time, if I had been more specific, more persuasive, more prepared, more casual, or more serious, or more emphatic, sometimes that analysis is correct. Timing and phrasing genuinely do matter. There are moments when a different approach to the same conversation would have produced a different result. But more often, the failure happened before the words, and the words were just the moment it became visible. Here is what most people don't fully account for when they're thinking about asking for things. Asking is not merely an exchange of information. It is not simply transmitting a request from your mind to someone else's and waiting for them to process it logically. Asking is a social event. It carries history, relationship, dynamics, and meaning. And people respond to all of that, not just to the literal content of the request. When you ask someone for something, they are processing multiple channels at once. They are hearing your words, yes, but they are also reading your tone. Is there tension in it, or ease? Are you slightly anxious or genuinely relaxed? They are reading your body language if you're in person. Are you taking up your natural space? Or are you slightly smaller than usual? They are reading the history between you. What has the pattern been? Are you someone they trust? Are you someone who gives as well as takes? They are reading what this request means, given everything they know about you and the relationship. And they are reading the situation. Does this feel right? Or does something feel slightly off? And all of that processing happens fast. Most of it happens below the level of conscious thought. The response, the lean toward yes or the lean toward no, is forming before the other person could articulate why. That is the first reason asking sometimes fails. The outcome is already being shaped by things that your words can't reach, because those things were already in motion long before you spoke. The second reason is this asking creates a power differential. This sounds subtle, but it matters enormously, and it matters in a way that is often invisible to the person doing the asking. When you ask for something, you are, in that moment, placing the decision in someone else's hands. You are making them the one with the power in this exchange. They can give or withhold. They can decide. You are waiting for their response. Now, there is nothing inherently wrong with that dynamic. Asking is natural and much of life requires it. The problem arises in how people experience being on the receiving end of an ask. Some people, in some contexts, respond to being asked with genuine generosity. They feel trusted. They feel that the person cares enough to come to them directly. They feel that the ask is an acknowledgement of their capability or their position, and they rise to meet it gladly. But other people, in other contexts, experience being asked differently. They feel put on the spot. They feel that a decision is being pressed on them. They feel, even with the most gentle and reasonable request, a kind of pressure. The pressure of now having to choose. And when people feel pushed, even subtly, something in them pulls back. This pulling back is not always conscious. It is not always logical. It is not always fair to the person asking. But it is real, and it is predictable. Psychologists call this phenomenon reactance. It points to something deeply embedded in human psychology when people sense that their freedom to choose is being constrained or pressured. Even minimally, even unintentionally, they tend to move toward the opposite of what you want. Not because they disagree with your request, but because something in them resists the feeling of being pushed toward any particular choice. This is why the harder some people push for something, the further away it gets. Not because the thing they want is unreasonable, but because the pushing itself is creating resistance. You've probably experienced this yourself from the inside of it. Someone wants something from you, a commitment, a decision, an agreement, and the more they press, the more you feel a quiet certainty forming that you're going to say no, or at least hedge, or at least delay, not because their request is bad, but because the pressing creates a reaction in you that moves away from agreement. This is the dynamic, and understanding it is essential to understanding why asking, particularly insistent asking, repeated asking, pressured asking, often produces exactly the opposite of what you're after. The third reason asking fails is subtler still, and it has to do with context you cannot see. When you're formulating your request, you're working from your own perspective. You know your situation, your needs, your reasons, your intentions. You've thought it through from where you stand, but the other person is inhabiting an entirely different interior world. They have their own concerns, their own pressures, their own reading of the dynamic between you. They have their own interpretation of what your request signals, what it means about you, about what you want from them, about where this relationship is going. And they have their own history of situations similar to this one that is informing how they're reading this particular moment. None of that is visible to you, but all of it is shaping their response. Maybe they've been feeling undervalued in this relationship, and your ask, however innocent, lands on top of that unspoken feeling. Maybe they're already stretched in ways you have no way of knowing, and your timing, however reasonable from your side, catches them in a moment of genuine depletion. Maybe something in the way you phrased it triggered an association with a pattern they've experienced before. A pattern they've decided they don't want to repeat. You are asking into a situation you can only partially see, and the response that comes back is shaped by the full situation, including all the parts that are invisible to you. This is not a reason to stop asking. It is a reason to be curious before you ask, to pay attention to what you can observe about the other person's state and context before you make a request, to sometimes ask what's going on with them before you ask for anything from them. Not because you're being strategic, but because genuinely understanding someone's situation before asking anything of them is both more respectful and more effective. The fourth reason, and this one deserves real attention, is that asking sometimes reveals something about your position that works against you. When you ask, you are revealing something, your need, your interest, your level of investment in this outcome, and depending on the dynamic you're in, that revelation shifts things. Let's be clear, this is not an argument for hiding what you want or pretending you don't care when you do. Authentic concealment of genuine needs is not what this audiobook advocates for, and most attempts to appear indifferent when you're actually invested are visible and ring false. But there is a difference between clarity and exposure. There is a difference between knowing what you want and making your need so visible, your urgency so apparent, that it shifts the power dynamics in ways you didn't intend. A simple example: imagine you're trying to find a resolution in a negotiation. If you make it obvious, through your phrasing, your urgency, your willingness to keep asking how much you need this particular deal to happen, the other party now has information about your leverage, your alternatives, your threshold, and that information changes their options. The same dynamic plays out in everyday situations. When you ask in a way that reveals urgency, dependency, or desperation, even unintentionally, the response you get is shaped by that revelation as much as by the content of the request. There is also a fifth reason, less obvious than the others, but worth naming. Sometimes asking fails because it is too early. Trust is not uniform. It exists on a spectrum, and where the current relationship sits on that spectrum determines what kinds of asks are available to you right now. You might want something significant from someone you haven't yet built the level of trust with that would make that ask feel natural. And so the ask arrives in a context where it's too large for the foundation beneath it. The relationship doesn't have the depth yet to carry that weight. The failure of the ask is not telling you that this person will never help you with this. It is telling you that the foundation isn't deep enough yet. That the work to be done right now is not the conversation you tried to have, but the relationship you haven't yet built. Understanding the difference between "this person won't help me" and "I haven't yet created the context where they can easily help me" is enormously clarifying. Because if it's the latter, you're not stuck. You just have different work to do right now. So where does all of this lead? If asking sometimes creates resistance, if it shifts the power dynamic in unhelpful ways, if it happens inside invisible contexts you can't fully see, if it sometimes reveals vulnerabilities you didn't mean to expose, and if it sometimes simply arrives too early on a foundation that isn't ready for it, then what is the alternative? The alternative is not silence. It is not passivity. It is not waiting and hoping that things will somehow arrange themselves the way you want them to. The alternative is active, thoughtful, and ultimately more effective. It is understanding that the outcomes you want can come through channels that don't require asking at all, or that make asking, when you do it, feel so natural and so aligned with the existing context that the answer comes easily, not because you've pushed for it, but because it was already the obvious next step. It is understanding that your behavior, Your presence, your environment, and your positioning are already influencing situations constantly, every day, in every interaction, whether you're aware of it or not. The question is not whether you're influencing. The question is whether you're doing it consciously or by accident. It is understanding that influence begins long before words, and that when you get that part right, when the context before the ask is already working in your favor, the ask itself, when it comes, often isn't even necessary. Outcomes begin to happen without you having to engineer them. Not because you've been clever, not because you've used a technique, but because you've understood something true about how people respond, and you've had the patience and the self-awareness to align yourself with that understanding. That is where we're going next. The psychology of response, how people really react, what they're actually responding to, and why that knowledge changes everything about how you approach the situations and relationships that matter most to you. People believe they respond to reasons. Give them a good enough reason, they tell themselves, and they'll say yes. Make a strong enough case. Show the logic, demonstrate the benefit. Provide evidence. Make the argument clear enough that the answer simply follows from the reasoning, and reasons do matter. Rational arguments do have weight. Good logic can move people. But if you've ever watched a room respond to two different people making essentially the same argument, the same content, the same information, the same logical structure, and seen the room receive those arguments very differently, then you already know that something beyond the content is doing significant work. One person speaks and the room leans in. The air changes. There's an openness, an interest, a readiness to be convinced. Another person says almost the same words, makes almost the same case, and the room quietly retreats. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly the energy contracts. People become slightly more critical. They look for holes. They find reasons it won't work. The logic hasn't changed. The facts haven't changed. The argument is functionally identical. But something has changed, and everyone in the room feels it even if they couldn't name what it is. What they're feeling is the difference in presence, in signal, in what each person is communicating before and beyond and underneath their words, understanding the full spectrum of what people actually respond to is the beginning of a different kind of social intelligence, not social manipulation, social awareness, the real skill of knowing what is actually happening in an interaction and why. Let's start with something that is both fundamental and often uncomfortable to sit with. Human beings are, at a very deep level, threat detection machines. Your nervous system is designed to scan for danger. Not just physical danger, that is the most obvious level, but social danger, status danger, the risk of being used, deceived, overlooked, or disrespected. The subtle alarm that says something is wrong here. I don't fully trust this person. I should be careful. That alarm does not always have a clear trigger. Often it fires in response to signals below conscious awareness, a slight tension in someone's voice, a micro-expression that flashes across their face and disappears before you consciously registered it. The way they hold their body when they think you're not watching. Something slightly off in the way their friendliness and their body language don't quite match. When this alarm fires, even faintly, even just as a vague sense that something isn't quite right, it changes everything about how a person responds to you. They become guarded. They find reasons to say no, or to delay, or to soften their commitment in ways that let them exit later if needed. They listen to you differently, not openly, looking for ways to say yes, but protectively, looking for things to be cautious about. Not because they've made a conscious decision to distrust you, but because something below consciousness has already made that decision for them, and they are now operating in a different mode. Here is the important part. Most people who trigger this reaction in others don't know they're doing it. They're not threatening, they're not aggressive, they're not even making an unreasonable request. but something in their presence. Their tension, their need, their urgency, their subtle insecurity, their barely visible manipulation is sending a signal. And that signal is landing, doing its work, shaping responses, before anyone is consciously aware of it. This is why the most foundational principle of effective presence is not technique or strategy. It is state. What internal state are you actually in when you interact with someone? Are you calm or anxious, centered or scattered, clear about what you want or secretly uncertain, comfortable being with this person or slightly braced for how they might respond, genuinely interested in them or mostly interested in what you can get from this interaction? Your state broadcasts, all the time, through your posture and your pace, your eye contact and your breathing, your voice and your micro-expressions, your timing, the way you choose when to speak and when to stay quiet, through the subtle ways you either hold your natural space or contract slightly away from it. And the people around you read that broadcast, whether they mean to or not, whether they're aware of it or not. This means that before you say a single word, you are already communicating something, already sending signal, already shaping the space in which your words will land. The question is not whether you're communicating before you speak. The question is, what are you communicating? A person who enters an interaction genuinely calm, not performing calm, not suppressing anxiety beneath a calm surface, but actually calm at the level below performance, is communicating something fundamentally different from someone who is anxious and trying to look relaxed. The difference between those two states is felt by others, not always named, but felt. And the responses each of those people generates will be different, even if the words they use are identical. Now, let's go deeper, because there is more happening in these moments than just safety signals. People also respond to what might be called status signals. Status here is not about hierarchy or position. It is not about who has formal power over whom. It is about the social sense of confidence, capability, and ease. It is about whether someone seems comfortable in their own presence, comfortable taking up space, comfortable being heard. People who carry what we might call social ease, who take up space without apology, who are comfortable being still when others are filling space, who don't over-explain or over-justify, who speak at their own natural pace, who can allow silence without rushing to eliminate it. These people are received differently, not with deference, necessarily, but with openness, with a willingness to engage, to listen, to give weight to what they're saying. Something in others relaxes in the presence of genuine ease, and from that relaxation, they are more available to say yes. The opposite signals, over-apologizing before asking anything, shrinking in space rather than taking your natural amount, speaking faster than the situation requires, qualifying every statement as if preemptively defending it against an attack that hasn't come, looking for approval after you've said something, filling silence with words that weren't needed. These signals communicate something, not about your worth or your intelligence, but about your level of ease. And low ease, even in small doses, tends to make others slightly more critical, slightly more guarded, slightly more inclined toward caution. Understanding this is not about performing social ease. Performance is visible and tends to ring hollow precisely because it is performance rather than reality. It is about genuinely developing ease, genuine comfort with yourself, genuine clarity about what you want, genuine willingness to take up your natural space without feeling that doing so imposes on anyone. That is something that can be developed. We'll get to how. People also respond powerfully to reciprocity signals. Human beings are wired for balance and fairness at a very deep level. The sense that an exchange is equitable, that something is given and something is received, that the relationship isn't draining in one direction, is important to most people, most of the time. When you give something to someone, genuine attention, practical help, care in a difficult moment, effort on their behalf, something in them inclines toward reciprocating. not as a mechanical transaction, as a natural response to the felt sense of balance and fairness. This is not a technique to deploy. The moment you begin giving specifically to create obligation, when the giving is a calculated move toward a future ask, it stops working, and it often backfires, because people can feel the transaction underneath. There is a quality to instrumental generosity that is distinguishable from genuine generosity, and people learn that quality quickly. What works is generosity that has no specific agenda attached to it. Generosity that flows from genuine interest in the other person's situation, genuine care about their well-being, genuine satisfaction in being helpful. That kind of generosity, clean, without calculation, creates something real. It creates goodwill. It creates a genuine inclination in others to give back. And it builds a relationship that carries you through difficult moments in ways that strategic generosity never could. People also respond to the accumulated evidence of who you are over time. This is enormously important and often underestimated. A single interaction is not where most of influence is decided. Reputation. The accumulated impression people have of you based on everything they've experienced and heard is doing more work in any given conversation than the conversation itself. When someone who has consistently shown up with integrity, reliability, and genuine care makes a request, that request lands on a foundation of accumulated trust. The answer tends to come easily, not because the request is exceptional, but because the trust beneath it is solid. When someone who has been inconsistent, unreliable, or self-serving makes the same request, the answer comes with friction, not because the request is unreasonable in isolation, but because the pattern beneath it creates hesitation. And here is what most people mistrust is not primarily built in dramatic moments. It is not built when you do something heroic or impressive or obviously virtuous. Trust is built in small, quiet, unobserved moments. When you follow through on a minor commitment that no one would have held you to if you hadn't. When you tell the truth in a small situation when the easy thing would have been to soften it. When you show up for someone in a modest way when showing up had no strategic value for you. Those moments accumulate. Over weeks and months and years, they form the foundation that determines what kinds of asks will land easily and what kinds will meet resistance. You are building that foundation all the time, every interaction, however small. The question is whether you're building it deliberately or by default. People respond to your belief in the outcome. When you approach a situation with genuine, quiet confidence that things will go well, not desperate hoping, not performed certainty, but actual calm assurance, something in others responds to that. Not because your belief has magical properties, but because genuine confidence changes your behavior in ways that are visible, and changed behavior creates different responses. When you expect a positive outcome, you're more relaxed. You listen better. You allow more space in conversations. You're less defensive, less guarded, less likely to push when pushing isn't serving you. And all of that, the relaxation, the openness, the space you allow, makes it easier for others to come toward you and toward the outcome you're working for. Contrast that with the behavior that comes from secretly expecting failure or resistance. The slight bracing, the over-preparation for arguments that might not even arise. The way you hold back just slightly because you're not sure this is going to go well. The defensive posture that forms before anything difficult has even been said. People feel that too, and it makes them slightly more cautious in response. Not because they've made a conscious decision, because your internal expectation has leaked into everything about how you're showing up, and they're responding to what they feel rather than just to what you're saying. Your internal state is not private. It shapes everything you do, and everything you do shapes what happens. So what, in summary, do people actually respond to? They respond to safety, to the felt sense that you're not going to push them somewhere they don't want to go, that being around you is not a source of pressure or anxiety. They respond to presence, to the genuine sense that you are actually here, actually grounded, actually comfortable being in this moment with this person. They respond to ease, to the quality that signals comfort in your own skin, comfort with space, comfort with silence. They respond to trust, to the accumulated pattern of who you've shown yourself to be over time. They respond to reciprocity, to the feeling that exchanges with you are balanced, that you give as well as take. That time spent with you leaves them feeling better rather than depleted. They respond to your belief, to the quality of confidence or doubt that permeates everything you do. And they respond to all of this before they process your words, which means that the most important work of influence is not in crafting better requests. It is in building better signals, developing genuine presence, creating genuine trust, cultivating genuine ease. The words come after. The words are the visible tip of everything invisible that has already been happening. That is what the next section is about. Not what you say, but what your behavior, before any words are exchanged, has already been saying. Everything you do sends a signal, not just in moments that feel important, in all moments, in the way you handle small things that seem not to matter, in how you treat people when there's nothing to gain from treating them well, in how you respond when things go sideways and you're tired and you didn't plan for this, in whether your presence on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing significant is happening is one that people look forward to or quietly work to avoid. All of it is signal. All of it is communication. All of it is shaping, invisibly and continuously, what happens when you want something from someone. This is one of the central insights in this audiobook, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before moving forward. Most people think about influence in terms of specific interactions. They think, how do I handle this particular conversation? How do I ask for this specific thing? How do I respond in this moment when the dynamic is challenging? Those questions of value, but they are late in the game. By the time you're asking them, the more powerful work is largely done, for better or worse. The more powerful question is this: what have I already built through my consistent behavior in ordinary moments that now determines how people respond to me when something specific is needed? Because by the time you're in the important conversation, the foundation is already there, and you are either standing on solid ground, in which case the conversation is relatively easy, or you are trying to have a difficult conversation on shaky footing, which is always harder than it needs to be. Let's look carefully at the behaviors that shape outcomes before a single word of your actual request is spoken. The first, and perhaps the most foundational, is follow through. Follow through is the foundation of trust, and trust is the foundation of almost everything else that matters in influence and relationship. But follow through is not primarily about grand commitments. Grand commitments are easy to remember and therefore more likely to be honored, if only to avoid the obvious social cost of obvious failure. The real work of follow through happens with small commitments. The email you said you'd send and then forgot about. The thing you mentioned you'd look into and never did. The appointment you moved and then moved again because it was easy to reschedule. The small favor you said you'd do and then, when it slipped your mind, told yourself it probably didn't matter because it was such a minor thing. It mattered, not because the other person was keeping score in a conscious way. Most people aren't, but because each small instance of not following through deposits something into an account. A quiet, unexamined sense that your word and your reality have a gap between them. That when you say something will happen, there is some probability that it won't. That you require a certain amount of maintenance and follow up to actually do what you've indicated you'll do. That sense, once it exists, even slightly, even below the threshold of conscious awareness, makes people less willing to rely on you, less willing to extend themselves on your behalf, less inclined to give you what you want without hesitation. Whereas when you follow through consistently, especially on the things no one would have noticed or held you accountable for, you build something quietly extraordinary. You build the sense that your word means something, that when you say a thing will happen, it does, that you are someone who can be relied upon in the invisible moments, not just the visible ones. That sense is worth more than almost any communication skill. It is the ground that makes all the other work possible. The second behavior is consistent presence in relationship. Consistent presence means showing up in someone's life with attention, care, effort, not just when you need something from them. Some people are very present when they need something. They reach out with warmth and interest. They engage meaningfully. They make you feel seen and valued. And then, when the need has been met, they recede. The warmth fades. The engagement becomes harder to come by. The interest that was so present before is now elsewhere. People learn this pattern, not always consciously, but they learn it. They develop a sense of what it means when you show up with warmth and interest. They start to feel, before you've asked anything, what's coming, and they brace against it. Consistent presence is the opposite of that. It means reaching out and engaging when you don't need anything, showing genuine interest in what's happening in someone's life when there is no strategic reason to do so. Being available and attentive in ordinary moments, not just in moments when your attention serves a purpose. This is not about logging time or performing friendship. It is about actually caring about the people in your life beyond their utility to you. And when you genuinely do, when you're present, because presence matters to you and to them, not because you're building credit for a future request, it creates a fundamentally different quality of relationship. In that kind of relationship, your requests are received in a context of genuine goodwill, not because the other person has calculated a return on your investment, but because they genuinely like you, genuinely trust you, and genuinely want good things for you. And from that place, saying yes feels natural. It feels like something they want to do. That quality of genuine yes, the one that comes from real goodwill rather than from obligation or the path of least resistance, is what makes things actually change. Because when people genuinely want to help you, they help you in real ways. They bring creativity and care. They go beyond the minimum. They are, in the truest sense, on your side. The third behavior is how you handle difficulty and disappointment. This is where character becomes visible, because in easy moments, almost anyone can behave well. The real evidence of who you are is in the hard moments. When you've been let down, when you're frustrated, when something hasn't gone the way you wanted. Do you become reactive? Do you push harder, escalate, apply pressure when you don't get what you want? Do you withdraw and go silent in a way that lets people feel the cost of having disappointed you? Do you express frustration in ways that make others feel responsible for your emotional state? Or do you maintain your steadiness? Do you hear a no without collapsing into it or pushing through it? Do you express genuine frustration without aiming it at the person in front of you? Do you handle setbacks with the same quality of presence you bring to smooth moments? This matters enormously, because people are not just responding to what you want right now. They are, at a deeper level, assessing what it costs to be in relationship with you. One of the things they are quietly assessing is this: what is the cost of saying no to you? What happens if I disappoint you? What do I face if I push back? If the cost is high, if saying no means navigating your sulking, your pressure, your emotional withdrawal, your escalation, people will begin to say yes to you in order to avoid that cost. And that yes, the one given to avoid pain rather than to express genuine agreement, is not what you want. It is the worst version of getting what you want, because it is hollow, it breeds quiet resentment, it doesn't last, and it confirms in the person giving it that they should be more careful about committing to things with you in the future. But if the cost of saying no is manageable, If people learn through experience that disagreeing with you is safe, that they can push back without it becoming a thing, that you can hear a no without it changing the quality of the relationship, then something valuable happens. Their yeses become real. When they say yes, they mean it. When they agree, they're genuinely with you. When they help, they're choosing to help. And that quality of genuine, freely given agreement is the most powerful form of influence there is. Because it doesn't create resistance. It doesn't breed resentment. It endures. So the question worth asking yourself is not merely how do I get more yeses? The deeper question is, what do my current yeses actually mean? Are the people in your life agreeing because they want to, or because it's easier than the alternative? The fourth behavior that shapes outcomes is clarity about your own direction, not clarity in the sense of rigidity. Having fixed positions on everything and being unwilling to adapt, but clarity in the sense of actually knowing what you stand for, actually knowing where you're trying to go, actually having a view on what matters and what doesn't. People are drawn to clarity, not always because they agree with where the clear person is going, but because clarity gives them something solid to orient toward. With a genuinely clear person, you know where you stand. You know what they value. You know, roughly, what to expect. There is a coherence to their behavior that makes them legible, and legible people are easier to trust, even when you don't agree with them. Unclear people, people whose positions shift with social pressure, who seem not to know what they actually think until they know what others think, who project certainty they don't feel, create ambient uncertainty. You don't know what they really want. You don't know if what they're saying reflects what they actually believe. You don't know how to help them because they don't seem clear about what would help. When you are clear, when your values and your behavior and your words are consistent with each other, people don't have to decode you. They know where you stand, and from that knowing, it is much easier for them to move toward you. Clarity also reduces a specific form of resistance. When you are not clear about what you want, people often project their own fears and assumptions onto the ambiguity. They imagine the worst possibilities. They hedge, they slow down. When you are crystal clear, when what you want is specific and explicit and clearly connected to something that makes sense, there is less space for that projection. The fear has fewer places to hide. The path is visible, and visible paths are easier to walk. The fifth behavior is the quality of your attention. When you are with someone, in conversation, in a meeting, in any shared moment, are you actually with them? Real listening, real presence, real engagement is rare, genuinely rare. Most people, in most conversations, are significantly elsewhere. They're thinking about what to say next. They're managing an internal reaction to what was just said. They're monitoring how they're coming across. They're partly occupied with their phones, their plans, their concerns that have nothing to do with this person in front of them. The result is that most conversations feel slightly hollow. You get words, yes. You get information, maybe. But you don't get the feeling of being genuinely met by another person, of having what you're saying actually land on someone who is genuinely interested. When you provide that, when you actually listen, when you let what someone is saying land before you formulate your response, when your attention is genuinely on them rather than on your own inner process, people feel it. They may not consciously name it, but they feel it, and it creates something. It creates the sense of being seen, of being valued, of this conversation mattering, and people are deeply, reliably more inclined to respond generously, to help, to say yes, to go out of their way, for someone who has made them feel genuinely seen and heard. The sixth behavior, less obvious than the others but equally powerful, is your comfort with silence and space. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. They rush to fill it. They keep talking past the end of what actually needed to be said. They explain more than necessary, justify more than needed, add qualifications that weren't required. This discomfort with silence communicates something. It signals uncertainty, need, a quiet desire for the other person's validation. It creates, in the other person, a subtle pull toward critical evaluation. When someone is filling space unnecessarily, others begin, almost without realizing it, to look more carefully at what's being said. The over-effort becomes visible, and visible over-effort reduces rather than increases impact. Comfort with silence is different. It signals security. It says, I don't need to fill every moment. I don't need to convince you. I am comfortable with the space between words. I am comfortable waiting. When you can sit in silence, after you've made a point, after you've asked a question, after you've said something important, without rushing to add more, something shifts in the conversation. The other person has space to think, to feel, to come to their own response without being pushed toward it. And when people arrive at responses on their own, when they feel they've reached a conclusion through their own process rather than been guided to it, they hold that response differently. They feel ownership of it. And ownership is what makes change real and lasting. All of these behaviors follow through consistent presence, how you handle difficulty, clarity about your direction, the quality of your attention, comfort with space, are not techniques. They are dimensions of character. They are who you are consistently over time. And when they are genuinely who you are, not performances you've adopted for social purposes, but actual habits of being, the outcomes follow naturally, not because you've engineered them, because you've become someone that outcomes naturally flow toward. That is the most powerful and most enduring form of influence there is. There is a difference between wanting something and knowing what you want. This sounds simple. It sounds almost too simple to be worth saying, but the distinction matters in ways that most people have never fully explored. Most people operate somewhere in the middle. They have a general sense of what they're after: more respect, a better arrangement, a different response from someone, an outcome that hasn't been happening. But the wanting is vague, unformed, more a feeling than a picture. They know they want something to be different, but they haven't done the work of getting specific about what different would actually look like, what specific change would address the actual need. And that vagueness, which seems purely internal, is not actually invisible to others. You might think it's contained inside you, this uncertainty about what you actually want. But it leaks. It shows up in the inconsistency between what you say you want and how you behave, in the way you hedge when you seem to be going somewhere, in the quality of your requests, which carry a kind of softness at the center, an uncertainty about whether you're really asking or just floating a possibility. People feel the difference between clarity and vagueness even when they can't articulate it, and they respond to it. Clarity, genuine, specific, internally resolved clarity about what you want and why, changes everything about how you move through a situation. It changes your posture, your tone, the kinds of things you say, and the kinds of things you feel no need to say. It changes what you notice and what you let pass. And it changes, very specifically, how others respond to you. Here is one of the most important reasons why. When you are clear about what you want, you stop doing something that most people do constantly without realizing it, sending mixed signals. Mixed signals are exhausting for the people around you. When your signals are inconsistent, when what you're saying and what you're doing and what you seem to actually want don't align, people have to work to figure out what you actually mean. They have to invest energy in decoding you, in testing different interpretations of your behavior to find the one that makes sense, in adjusting their responses as your apparent wants shift. At some point, without making a conscious decision, they start spending less energy on that decoding. They let your situation drift. They give your outcomes less active attention, not out of hostility, but because the cognitive cost of figuring out what you want has become too high. clarity eliminates that cost. When you are clear, when your behavior, your words, and your apparent internal state are all saying the same thing, people don't have to decode you. They understand what you want, and understanding what you want makes it much easier for them to help you get it. But clarity is only part of what this section is about. Positioning is the other part. And positioning is the practice of where you place what you want in relation to what others want. This is perhaps the most important strategic insight in this entire audiobook. Most people, when they want something, position it as something they want. They make it about their need, their situation, their request. They present the case for why this would be good for them and hope that the other person cares enough about their well-being to help. And sometimes that works. In relationships of genuine care, people want good things for each other and are motivated by each other's well-being. But in many situations, particularly professional ones or newer relationships, or situations where the alignment of interests isn't already obvious, the fact that something would be good for you is not sufficient motivation for someone else to help it happen. It is relevant information, but it is not the engine of their response. The engine of their response is what matters to them. This is not selfishness on their part. It is just how human motivation works. We are all, at the most fundamental level, oriented toward our own concerns, our own interests, our own world. That is natural and rational, not shameful, and the person making a request has to account for that reality, not resent it, not try to overcome it through the force of their argument. Account for it and work with it. Positioning is the practice of placing what you want inside a frame that makes genuine sense from the other person's perspective, not by manufacturing false alignments that is dishonest and quickly detected, but by taking the time to actually understand what they care about and then finding the real connection between that and what you want. If there is no real connection, if what you want genuinely conflicts with what they want, positioning won't fix it. Positioning is not spin. It is the practice of making genuine alignments visible. But here is the thing that most people miss in the majority of situations. Genuine alignments exist. They're just not visible because we're too focused on our own side of things to look for them. When you take the time, genuinely, not as a technique, but as an act of real curiosity, to understand what matters to the other person, what they're working toward, what their concerns are, what would make their situation better, you almost always find areas of genuine overlap with what you want. And when you can present what you want in a way that honestly connects to what they care about, the quality of the conversation changes completely. The request stops feeling like a demand you're making. It starts feeling like a natural next step in a shared direction. That is what alignment feels like. And when alignment is present, the question of whether to say yes becomes much less fraught. There is a specific dimension of positioning that relates to how you frame yourself in relation to the outcome. When you want something, you are implicitly positioning yourself in one of two ways. Either as someone who needs this thing, someone who is waiting for a decision, dependent on the other person's choice, hoping for a favorable answer, or as someone who is already moving in a direction, and this particular thing is a natural step in that ongoing movement. The first position creates the power differential we talked about in the section on asking. It places you in the role of supplicant, and that role, however subtly it manifests, affects the quality of what you receive. The second position is entirely different. When you are someone who is already in motion, already going somewhere, already building something, already on a path, your requests feel less like need and more like momentum. And people want to be part of momentum. They want to support something that is already moving. This is why knowing where you're going, having genuine direction, genuine clarity about the larger arc of what you're building, changes the nature of every specific request you make. When the request is a step in a coherent journey, it carries a different quality than when it's a standalone ask arising from need. Timing is another dimension of positioning that is consistently underestimated. Everything you want exists inside a context that is constantly shifting, and that shifting context makes some moments vastly more receptive than others. Most people ignore this. They ask when asking is convenient for them, when they happen to think of it, when the desire is fresh, when the opportunity presents itself. They don't pay much attention to whether this particular moment is one where the other person is likely to be receptive. And so they get results that would have been different if they'd simply waited a day or created a different context around the conversation before having it. Receptive moments are when the other person is not under acute pressure about something that has nothing to do with you, when they've recently had a positive experience and are in a generous orientation, when there is recent goodwill between you, when they have the space, cognitive and emotional, to genuinely engage with what you're bringing. Unreceptive moments are the opposite: stress, friction, recent conflict, depletion, distraction. You can sometimes feel these states when you're in conversation with someone. There are moments when the air between you feels open and moments when it feels contracted. Most people push forward regardless of what they feel because they want what they want when they want it. But pausing, choosing to wait for a more receptive moment, or doing something small to create a more open context before the conversation can change everything. Not because you've been clever, but because you've paid attention to the human being in front of you and cared enough to engage them at a time that actually works. Let go is the last, and perhaps most counterintuitive, element of positioning: attachment to a specific outcome. A tight, anxious grip on needing things to go exactly one way often prevents the outcome from happening. When you are very attached to a specific result, it changes how you carry yourself. You become less flexible, less able to hear what's actually being said, less able to respond to what's actually happening rather than to the story in your head about what must happen. You push when the situation is calling for you to wait. You hold on when the moment is asking you to release. And that grasping, even when it's subtle, even when you're trying to hide it, is felt by others. It creates the resistance we've been talking about throughout this audiobook. Letting go is the practice of holding what you want in open hands rather than tight ones. Knowing clearly what you're working toward, moving toward it with genuine effort and skill, and also being genuinely, not performatively, okay if things unfold differently than you anticipated. This combination, clear direction and genuine release, changes everything about your presence. You become someone who is moving towards something without being desperate about it. And that quality is far more magnetic than the quality of desperate grasping. People are drawn toward openness. They move away from desperation. When you can want something genuinely without being desperate about it, you create the most fertile possible ground for that thing to arrive. If this audiobook is resonating, if the ideas are landing, take a moment to follow or subscribe. It helps more people find this content. And if someone in your life is navigating situations where they could use a different approach, share this with them. Now, let's continue. So far, we have been talking about you, your behavior, your presence, your signals, your clarity, your internal state. But influence does not happen in a vacuum. It happens inside situations. And situations have their own logic, their own momentum, their own capacity to shape what happens inside them. The environment and context surrounding an interaction do far more work than most people recognize. And when you learn to see that, to understand how context shapes response, you gain access to a form of influence that requires no words at all. Let's start with something foundational that most people know in theory, but rarely apply in practice. People are more influenced by their context than they believe they are. There is a story most people tell about how they make decisions. The story goes something like, I think things through. I weigh my options. I consider what I actually want. I make a choice based on my own reasoning. That story is not false. People do reason. They do weigh things. They do choose. But the context in which they reason, weigh, and choose is shaping every step of that process. The setting they're in, the mood they arrived in, the thing that happened right before this conversation, the framing of the options as they understand them, the other people in their life who seem to be moving in similar or different directions, the recent experiences that have sensitized them to certain concerns, all of that context is exerting influence. Quietly, continuously, below the level of conscious decision-making. This is not a dark or cynical insight. It is simply true that human beings are contextual creatures. We are embedded in our environments, and those environments shape us, moment by moment, in ways we rarely notice. The question is, do you understand how this works? And if you do, can you work with it thoughtfully? Not to manipulate, but to create conditions where the outcome you want is the natural, easy, unsurprising one. Physical setting is the first element worth examining. Where a conversation happens influences how it unfolds. More than people typically account for. Formal settings, structured offices, meeting rooms, anywhere built for professional distance and organizational role, playing, activate certain modes of response. People become more guarded, more formal, more aware of their role and its implied limitations. The environment reminds them of hierarchy, of precedent, of the expected way things are done here. More neutral, relaxed, informal settings tend to produce something different. People are more willing to think out loud, more open to genuine exchange, more available to the kind of honest, direct conversation that formal settings often suppress. This matters when you have a choice. And sometimes you do have a choice. You can suggest where a conversation happens, a walk instead of a meeting room, a coffee instead of a conference call, somewhere that feels like people rather than institution. When you shift the setting to somewhere that allows more human connection, you often shift the quality of what becomes possible in the conversation. Sequencing is the second element of context that shapes outcomes. What comes before a conversation shapes that conversation in powerful ways. If you've just shared a genuine moment of warmth with someone, they're in a different state to receive what you bring next than if you've just had a difficult exchange. If you've just done something that generated real goodwill, helped without being asked, offered something without expecting return, the context around your next interaction is different from the context that exists after a period of distance or friction. You often can't control everything that comes before a conversation, but you can be aware of what the recent context has been, and sometimes you can do something to shift it before you have an important exchange, not as a calculated move, as a genuine act of care, a check-in, a helpful gesture, a moment of real warmth that creates a better baseline before something important needs to be discussed. Social proof is the third element of context that matters enormously. When people are uncertain about what to do, they look to others. This is not weakness or laziness. It is a rational use of available information. Other people's choices tell you something about what's worth doing, what's safe, what's acceptable. When many others are already moving in a direction you want to encourage, pointing to that movement is not manipulation. It is helping someone see the broader context. It is reducing the uncertainty and the isolation of a particular choice by making it clear that this is something others are also doing. The isolation of being the first person to choose something is real. When you're the first mover, you take all the risk of being wrong. When you're following a well-worn path, you have company and precedent. Understanding that helps you understand why some asks are harder than others, not because the thing is bad, but because it requires someone to go first in a way that feels exposed. Framing is the fourth element, and perhaps the one with the most direct application. The same situation framed differently produces different responses. This is not spin. This is a genuine reality about how human minds process information. The context we put around a piece of information shapes how it is understood and felt. A loss feels different from a missed gain of the same value, even though they're mathematically equivalent. A 90% success rate feels different from a 10% failure rate. Being told, "Most people in your situation choose this," feels different from being told nothing about what others choose. These framings are not dishonest when they reflect genuine truths about the situation. They are choices about which true angle to lead with, and the choice of angle shapes everything that follows. When you want to have a productive conversation about something difficult, consider what honest framing gives the other person the best angle of entry. Not a false frame that erodes trust quickly, but a genuine one that opens the conversation rather than defensively closing it. Contrast is the fifth element of context. What something is compared to shapes how it is experienced. A reasonable request seems even more reasonable next to an unreasonable one. A good outcome seems excellent when the alternatives are worse. An easy commitment feels natural when harder commitments are what the conversation has been about. You are not responsible for manufacturing false contrasts, but you are responsible for making sure the genuine range of options is visible. All of it, not just the parts that favor what you want. Because when the full picture is available, the honest evaluation of where your option sits in that range does your work for you. You don't have to oversell. Reality makes the case. The sixth element of context is consistency with what people have already committed to. People are powerfully motivated to be consistent with their prior positions. When someone has publicly stated a view, they tend to act in line with it. When they've made a commitment, they want to honor it. Not always. Human inconsistency is real, but the pull toward consistency is strong. When you're trying to move someone in a direction, one of the most natural paths is helping them see how that direction is genuinely consistent with what they've already said they care about, not as a trap, not as a way of locking them in, but as a genuine connection. You've talked about how important X is to you. What I'm suggesting is a way to actually move toward X. That's not manipulation. That's alignment. Context is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in creating. Through the history you build, the settings you choose, the sequences you arrange, the framings you present, the comparisons you make visible. When you understand context, when you see how it shapes responses, you stop fighting against unfavorable conditions and start taking the time to create more favorable ones. You stop trying to force outcomes through pressure and start understanding how to make the outcomes you want the natural, easy, obvious ones. That understanding is itself a form of influence. A quiet one that doesn't look like influence at all. It just looks like things going well. There is a quality that cuts through almost everything else. It is not charisma, though it can look like charisma from the outside. It is not authority, though people with it are often listened to as though they carry authority. It is not charm, though interactions with people who have it tend to be pleasant and memorable and worth returning to. It is calm confidence, and it is different from all of those things because unlike those things, which can be performed, at least briefly, calm confidence cannot be sustainably performed. It can only be genuinely held. Calm confidence is an internal state that becomes visible through the totality of how you carry yourself, how you speak, how you listen, how you respond, how you simply are when there's nothing to perform and nothing to prove. And in the realm of influence and communication, it is perhaps the most powerful thing you can develop. Not because it is the most dramatic or the most obviously strategic, but because everything else we've discussed in this audiobook rests on it as a foundation. You can know all the right behaviors and still undermine them with an anxious presence. You can use all the right framings and still create resistance through a grasping energy. You can have clarity about what you want and still push people away with the desperation underneath the clarity. Calm confidence is what turns all the other elements into something integrated and coherent. It is the quality that makes your behavior readable and trustworthy, your positioning credible and compelling, your presence something people find themselves drawn to. Let's start with what calm confidence actually is, because the words are familiar enough that it's easy to believe you already understand, and therefore miss what's actually being said here. A calm confidence is not the absence of uncertainty. People who are genuinely calmly confident can be uncertain about outcomes. They can not know how things will unfold. They can be in situations with genuine risk and genuine unknowns. The confidence is not in the situation. It is in themselves, in their capacity to meet whatever comes. This is a subtle but transformative distinction. Most people believe they can only feel confident when they know how things will go, when they have enough certainty about the outcome to relax. So they spend enormous energy seeking that certainty, trying to control variables, trying to anticipate every response, trying to prepare for every contingency, before they allow themselves to feel okay. But that approach to confidence keeps you perpetually on edge, because certainty is never fully available. Situations are always more complex than your preparation. People are always at least somewhat unpredictable. And so the goal of certainty before confidence becomes a treadmill that keeps moving faster than you can run. Genuine confidence doesn't depend on knowing the outcome. It depends on trusting your capacity to handle what comes, whatever form that takes. It is rooted in accumulated experience of navigating difficulty, of having faced hard things and discovered, repeatedly, that you could handle them, that they didn't end you, that you had more capacity than you feared. When that is your actual inner experience, when you have genuinely tested yourself in difficult situations and emerged with knowledge of your own resilience, your presence changes. The tension of trying to control the uncontrollable dissolves. What's left is a settled, open readiness, and that quality is what others experience as calm confidence. Calm confidence is also not the absence of care. Some people confuse confident detachment, the appearance of not really caring about the outcome, with the genuine quality we're describing. They cultivate an attitude of indifference, thinking that appearing not to care is the same as being confident. But that's not the same thing, and people feel the difference. You can care deeply about something and still be calm. The caring doesn't have to manifest as anxiety. Deep investment in an outcome and genuine peace about how it unfolds are compatible. Some of the most powerful presences are people who are deeply passionate about what they're doing and completely settled in that passion. Their investment is visible and it draws people in. Their anxiety is absent, and that absence is what makes space for others to move toward them. Care plus calm. That combination is magnetic, because it says this person is genuinely committed to something real and they're not desperate about it. That is a very rare combination, and rarity, in the context of presence and influence, is worth a great deal. Now let's look at how genuine calm confidence is actually developed. The first source is what might be called earned self-knowledge. One of the primary drivers of anxiety in social situations is this: you're not entirely sure of your own value. Not consciously, perhaps, but somewhere beneath the surface there is uncertainty about whether you are worth listening to, whether what you want is legitimate, whether you deserve what you're asking for, whether you are enough. That uncertainty doesn't stay inside. It colors everything. It shows up in the slight defensiveness when you're challenged, the over-explaining when a simple statement would do, the need to convince rather than simply communicate, the looking for approval after you've said something, rather than simply letting what you've said stand. When you develop genuine self-knowledge, when you understand, through honest self-examination, what you actually bring to situations, what your genuine strengths are, what you stand for, what makes your perspective worth engaging with, the uncertainty underneath dissolves. not into arrogance, into groundedness, into the quiet sense that you know who you are and what you're about, and that is sufficient. That you don't need everyone to agree, that you don't need to convince everyone, that you can simply show up and be what you are and let people respond as they will. That quality of showing up fully without needing the room's approval. That is what calm confidence feels like from the inside. The second source is clarity of values. When you know what genuinely matters to you, when you have real clarity about your values, your commitments, what you will and won't compromise on, you are less susceptible to being destabilized by external pressure or uncertainty. Without a clear internal compass, every challenging situation creates a small crisis because you don't have a reference point. You don't know what the right call is. You don't know what you're willing to give up and what you're not. Every decision requires starting from scratch, with a clear internal compass. Challenging situations are still challenging, but they're navigable. Your values have already made many decisions for you. You know what you're optimizing for. You can hold firm in moments of pressure because you know what you're standing for. You can let go of things you don't need to hold on to because you know what actually matters and what doesn't. That inner stability is visible, not as rigidity. Rigid people are not calm, they're defended, but as settledness, as the quality of someone who knows who they are and who doesn't need external circumstances to confirm it. The third element of developing calm confidence is what you do with difficult moments. Equanimity, the capacity to remain steady in the face of what is hard, is not a personality trait that some people have and others don't. It is a developed capacity, and it is developed the way all capacities are developed through practice, through repeatedly choosing to stay with difficulty rather than escaping it, through repeatedly choosing to respond thoughtfully rather than react automatically, until those choices become less effortful and more natural. Every time you face something hard and choose steadiness over reactivity, you are building the capacity for equanimity. Not quickly, not in a linear way, but over time, the accumulation of those choices creates a person who is genuinely different in difficult moments, less reactive, more present, more able to think clearly when circumstances are challenging. And that capacity, in the context of influence and communication, is extraordinary, because when things get difficult, when there's friction, disagreement, pressure, stakes, the person who can remain clear and grounded while others are being moved is the person who gets to shape what happens next. Calm confidence, developed genuinely, makes you that person. The fourth element is something simpler than it sounds: genuine comfort with your own company. What is it like to be with yourself in ordinary moments when there is nothing to do and no one to perform for? Many people are subtly uncomfortable with their own company. There is a restlessness, a need to be occupied, a discomfort with the quieter moments of simply being without doing or proving or producing, and that discomfort with oneself tends to leak into social situations as a subtle, unexamined need for others to fill something, to entertain, to approve, to validate, to provide enough external stimulation that the inner restlessness goes quiet. People feel this need, even when it's subtle. They feel that interacting with you is slightly demanding in a way they can't name, that you are not quite at rest in your own presence, and therefore they cannot be quite at rest in yours either. When you are genuinely comfortable with your own company, when you can be quiet and still and easy in yourself, that quality extends outward. People relax in your presence because you are not asking anything of them beyond simple engagement. You are not needing them to fill anything. You are simply there, and that is enough. And from that place of genuine ease, influence happens naturally. People want to be around someone who makes them feel relaxed. They open up, they trust. They say yes more easily, not because they've been asked effectively, but because being around you creates a quality of openness in them. There is a paradox at the center of everything we've been discussing. You want outcomes. You care about them. You are developing your presence and your behavior and your positioning because you want things to go well. You are paying attention to all of this because you want results. And at the same time, in the very same moment, you need to be genuinely okay if things don't go the way you want. This is not passivity. This is not resignation. This is not pretending not to care when you do. It is the recognition that there is a difference between working toward outcomes and forcing them, and that the energy of forcing, the grasping, the pushing, the over-controlling, is one of the most reliable ways to prevent outcomes from arriving. You've felt this dynamic in your own life. The more urgently you want something, the more complicated its arrival tends to become. The harder you push toward a particular result, the more the situation seems to resist. The tighter you hold on, the more strained things become. And then, in other moments where you've genuinely released something, where you've stopped pushing and simply moved naturally, things sometimes came together in ways they hadn't when you were working so hard at them. That experience is not random. It reflects something real about how influence actually works. Forcing changes the quality of everything you do. It creates a subtle tension, a grasping, an over-trying, that people around you feel and respond to by pulling back. The very effort to make something happen pushes it away, whereas genuine release changes the quality of everything differently. You become more natural, more easy, more actually present with what's happening rather than with what you need to happen, and people respond to that openness by moving toward you rather than away. The narrow path, the one worth finding, is between caring and releasing. To want something genuinely without needing it desperately. To work toward an outcome while being truly okay if it unfolds differently than you planned. This requires internal security, the kind that comes from knowing that your well-being is not entirely at the mercy of this particular outcome. That if this specific thing doesn't work out, you will be okay. Not easily, not painlessly, but okay. You have more resilience than this situation tests. You have other resources, other paths, other possibilities. When that knowing is real, not performed, not told to yourself as reassurance, but genuinely felt, your approach to situations changes. You become less reactive to fluctuations in whether things are going your way in this moment. You become a better listener, because you're not so focused on steering toward your desired destination that you can't actually hear what's being said. You become more creative, because you're not locked into one vision of how things must unfold. You can see possibilities you would have missed if you'd been too tightly held to a single picture. And you become, paradoxically, more effective, because the energy that was going into forcing, into pushing, worrying, over-managing, is now available for actual presence and genuine engagement. Let's look at specific practices that cultivate this capacity. The first is expanding what success can look like. Most people hold a very specific picture of the outcome they want, and they measure everything against whether it matches that picture. If it doesn't look exactly as imagined, they feel they've fallen short. But reality rarely looks exactly as imagined. It comes in forms that are adjacent, or different, or unexpectedly better in some dimensions and disappointing in others. When you can hold the essence of what you want, the underlying need, the core function it would serve, the genuine feeling it would create, more loosely than the specific form you imagined, you create room for reality to deliver something that actually works. Room to recognize an outcome as good even when it's different from what you pictured. This is not lowering your standards. It is expanding your ability to recognize when your real needs are being met. And that expanded recognition is itself a kind of intelligence, one that reduces the friction between what you want and what you receive. The second practice is building a life rich enough that no single outcome is existential. This is practical rather than philosophical, and it may be the most important thing in this section. When you have other options, when your relationships are full, your skills are multiple, your sense of identity is not riding on any one outcome, the desperation that grasps and pushes and forces simply doesn't arise as easily. Because nothing is everything when you have enough of the important things. You still want what you want. But the wanting doesn't become desperate. It doesn't become a crisis. It stays in proportion to what it actually is, one desired outcome among many possible ones. This is why investing in the full richness of your life, your skills, your relationships, your inner world, your range of options, is not separate from the work of influence and communication. It is central to it. A person with a full life approaches situations with a fundamentally different energy than a person who has staked everything on one outcome. The third practice is noticing the difference between effort and force. Effort is directed, useful energy moving a situation forward. It is doing the things that actually help. Force is effort past its point of usefulness. It is pushing when pushing is no longer what the situation needs. It is doing more of what isn't working because you're not sure what else to do, and stopping feels worse than continuing. The transition from effort to force is not always obvious from the inside. You're still doing something. You're still working toward the outcome. The behavior looks similar, but the quality is different, and the effect on the situation is different. Noticing when you've crossed from effort into force, when the pushing is creating more resistance than progress. And having the skill to stop when you do is enormously valuable. It requires asking yourself honestly, is what I'm doing right now actually moving this forward? Or am I doing it because stopping would mean sitting with uncertainty? Because the discomfort of inaction feels worse than the illusion of progress? If the answer is the second, if you're pushing primarily to avoid the discomfort of waiting, then stopping and letting the situation breathe is usually the more powerful move. The fourth practice is trusting the process that consistent behavior creates. This is, in some ways, the whole message of this audiobook expressed in a single idea. If you've shown up with integrity over time, if you've followed through, been present, handled difficulty with steadiness, been genuinely clear, listened with real attention, then you have built something. You have built trust, goodwill, a pattern of reliable engagement that carries weight in situations, even when you're not actively managing them. Trust that. Trust that the foundation you've been building is doing its work even in moments when you can't see it directly. Trust that the relationships you've invested in are carrying more influence in how outcomes unfold than any single strategic move could. And from that trust, ease up. Let things breathe. Create conditions that make the outcome you want the natural one, and then let people arrive at it in their own time, through their own process. There is something profound in letting people come to their own conclusions. Even conclusions you've made very easy for them to reach, because the conclusions people reach on their own, through their own thinking, in their own time, feel more genuinely theirs. They feel more committed. They feel more lasting, versus conclusions they arrive at because they were pushed or pressured. Those tend to be shallower, more easily reversed, more likely to produce quiet resentment than genuine agreement. Creating good conditions and then stepping back, planting seeds and trusting the soil, making the path clear and then allowing people to walk it at their own pace. This is the art, an art that takes practice and patience and genuine internal security. But when you have it, when you've genuinely internalized the understanding that your role is to show up well, to create good conditions, and then to allow something remarkable happens, outcomes arrive, not forced, not engineered, but naturally, as the result of everything that has been built and created and positioned and allowed, and they arrive in a form that is real and lasting. We have covered a significant amount of ground, but the core of everything in this audiobook is simple. Simpler, perhaps, than most people expect when they come to a question like the one in the title, because most people come expecting systems. techniques, step-by-step approaches for specific situations, scripts for when someone says this and you need them to say that. And what they find instead is something quieter, older, more foundational. They find that the most effective form of influence is not about what you do in the specific moment of wanting something. It is about who you are, how you show up, what you've built, and how you move through the world on all the ordinary days when nothing particular is at stake. Let's bring this back to something immediate. You want something, not abstractly, something specific, a better outcome in a relationship, a different dynamic at work, more from a situation that hasn't been delivering what you need, something that hasn't been happening and that matters to you. Most people in that situation start with the question, what do I say? What do I do in this particular moment to make this happen? How do I frame the ask? How do I structure the conversation? Those are not bad questions. There is value in them. But the more powerful questions, the ones this audiobook has been opening up, are different. What has already been happening in the weeks and months before this moment that is shaping whether it's possible? What have I been communicating before any words were exchanged? What trust exists or doesn't exist beneath this conversation? What quality of presence have I been bringing to my interactions with this person? What context have I created around what I want? And then, what in this current moment? The timing, the setting, the framing, the way I'm showing up, is working in my favor or not? What genuine alignment exists between what I want and what they care about? Have I found that alignment and made it visible? And finally, can I bring myself to this moment in a state that is genuinely calm, genuinely clear, genuinely present, and genuinely released from needing it to go one specific way? Those questions, taken seriously, address the actual levers, the things that actually determine what happens, and they require things of you. Self-awareness that most people have to deliberately develop. Honesty about patterns in your behavior that might be working against you. The patience to build trust over time rather than trying to shortcut it in a single interaction. The internal security to release outcomes you genuinely want. None of that is simple, but all of it is real, and all of it is available to you. The more you develop these capacities, not as techniques to deploy in high-stakes moments, but as genuine ways of being that become your natural default, the more you will notice something shifting. Outcomes that you used to work hard for begin to come more naturally. Not always, not in every case. There will always be situations where things don't go your way, where the gap between what you want and what happens is real and disappointing. That cannot be eliminated by any level of presence or preparation. Some things simply don't work out. But in general, across time, across the full range of your interactions and relationships and situations, something shifts. Things move more in your direction. People tend to respond more generously. Resistance shows up less often and softens more quickly when it does arrive. The path toward what you want is less obstructed, less effortful, less costly. And you notice, often, that you didn't have to push as hard as you used to. That outcomes you would have needed to fight for before began to arrive without a fight. That people offered things you would have had to ask for before, sometimes before you even formed the thought of asking. That is not magic. That is alignment. When your behavior, your presence, your clarity, your signals, and your relationships are all working in the same direction, when they are all saying the same thing, consistently, over time, the world tends to respond, not because you've manipulated it, but because you've understood something true about how it works. The people and situations in your life are constantly responding to information, to signals, to the accumulated impression of who you are and what interacting with you means. And when all of that information, all of those signals, that accumulated impression, when all of it consistently points toward someone trustworthy, clear, genuinely present, generously oriented, internally secure, people move toward that person. Opportunities find that person. Help comes to that person. Yeses are given to that person, not because they demanded or pressured, but because saying yes to them feels right. Natural, easy. Like the thing that was always going to happen. That is what this audiobook has been pointing toward. Not a collection of techniques, not a system for high-stakes moments, but a way of being that makes what you want the natural outcome of who you are. And this does not end with this audiobook. It continues tomorrow in the ordinary moments, in whether you follow through on the small thing you said you'd do, in whether you show up fully in the conversation that has no strategic value for you, in whether you stay steady when something doesn't go your way, in whether you remain clear about what you want and generous in how you understand what others want, in whether you do the invisible work that creates the visible outcomes. That is where the real practice lies, not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet ones, not in the high-stakes conversations, in the ordinary ones that build, over time, into something that makes the high-stakes conversations easy. You don't need to force outcomes. You need to understand how they happen. And when you do, when that understanding moves from idea to embodied reality, from concept to actual way of being, things begin to move, quietly, consistently, in your direction. Thank you for listening to How to Get What You Want Without Asking. If this audiobook gave you something, if even one idea shifted how you see a situation or approach a relationship, then it has done its work. Take what landed for you and bring it into tomorrow. And if someone in your life could use a different way of thinking about communication and influence, share this with them. It matters.